Welcome to Computer History with Chris Garcia. I am, in fact, Chris Garcia. Today, aren't all computers digital computers? It was at MIT where two engineers, Ken Olsen and Harlan Anderson, noticed a very unusual thing. Students would line up for hours to get a turn to use the stripped-down TX0 computer, while generally ignoring a faster IBM machine that was also available to them. It didn't make sense, because wouldn't students want access to the greater speed and processing power than they had such little time on the actual machine? The IBM certainly was more powerful. So what was it about TX0? They came to a conclusion. It was TX0's interactivity that drew them in. They might have missed that a lot of the stuff these students were working on were problems that weren't traditional computer science, things like games and art, sometimes program optimization even. But still, they had an industrious spirit that would not leave a potential dollar on the table. They figured an interactive computer made at a lower price point would be a great concept to found a company around. And so, in 1957, Anderson and Ken's brother, Stan Olsen, set out to find funding for Digital Computer Corporation. There was one minor problem, of course. No one wanted to fund them. It was up against a serious problem. Computer companies in the 1950s, like Electrodata and Engineering Research Associates, had just come and gone, gobbled up by larger companies for the most part. RCA and General Electric are great examples of that. They did get some serious thought, though, from American Research and Development Corporation, one of the more important private equity firms at the time. Co-founder, George Dorio, liked the idea of the company, but said they needed to come up with two minor changes. First, they needed a better business plan. Second, they really needed to change the name to get rid of the word computer. No one wanted to take a chance on a computer company in those days of IBM domination. Dorio eventually gave the trio $70,000 in exchange for 70% of their company. This was an incredibly wise investment. The first products were modules that could be made into computers by users. This could be seen easily in the use of these modules within Link, though they were slightly after the introduction of the first DEC computers. The modules were sort of little square boxes that had a DEC on the side that you could connect up through various cabling and so forth. It was in 1958 that their very first product, the Digital Laboratory Module line, came out. The modules consisted of germanium transistors and other discrete components mounted onto a circuit board. The circuits were basically the same as the ones used in TX2 logically, but they were housed again in that little sort of square boxy type thing. Perhaps the original beige box. The module proved to be popular with other companies to build test systems out of. Now, this inspired DEC to hop on board the obvious market, the test equipment market, which led to their first actual machine system, the memory test system, which was developed to test core memory systems. They sold about 50 of those, starting in 1959. They were already turning a half-decent product when they entered into stage 2, computers. I'm sorry, not computers. I mean, programmable data processors. That is one of the things that Dorio insisted on. Don't call them computers. Computers had a very narrow, specific meaning and required special permissions to get. Programmable data processors, not so much, even though they're literally the same thing. The first of these was announced and shown at the Joint Computer Conference in Boston in 1959. That machine, I believe, is in the collection of the Computer History Museum, and it is a very large beige box, roughly 3 refrigerators, one behind the other. In 1960, the PDP-1 came to market, with the first one going to BBN, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. It cost $120,000, but it was really impressive for that price. You got 4K of 18-bit storage, core memory, of course, and you got about 100,000 operations per second. It was made of system building blocks, which were easily swapped out and allowed for easier construction and testing, and they were packaged in that large refrigerator, sort of stacked together box. Some were horizontally placed. I've seen photos of some of them. White is what I keep hearing through it, but I've only seen them beige, where they're one next to the other. I've seen other ones where, including the one that's working at the Computer History Museum, where it is more frontward linear, so you just see the narrowest profile of it. Now, we talked about the PDP-1 in our last episode, but I'll add that PDP-1 sold about 53. They were delivered to universities, including Stanford, Yale, MIT. The MIT one, of course, as I mentioned, gave birth to hacker culture because it was used by the Tech Model Railroad Company, but it was also used, and often forgotten that companies used it, in things like aircraft. United Aircraft used it, Raytheon, Beckman Systems, and interestingly, JPL, Jet Propulsion Labs in Pasadena. By 1961, they had announced a faster version called the PDP-3, though it was really just a design. But they did make a single machine, a black budget 36-bit version of the PDP-1 that was built for Scientific Engineering Institute, a proud member of the CIA family. I've heard this called a PDP-1 stretched to a 36-bit word length. Also, I've seen it mentioned as a PDP-1 controlling a PDP-1, which is interesting. I don't know much about that one, and I'd really like to find out more. The PDP-2, just a few modules. It was never a complete system design. It wasn't until 1962 that a true follow-on to the PDP-1 was released. That was the PDP-4. It was cheaper, only $65,000. Still had that 18-bit word, but it had a slower memory. And they only sold about 50, but they did have a slightly different Model 30 type display. Now, there was already a clear need outside of what the PDP-1 and 4 were able to satisfy for machines that were smaller, had larger memory options, and were also cheaper. But it was also clear that 12-bit processing was good enough for most users, and thus the PDP-5. The machine was spec'd out by Alan Kotok, one of those folks who had been a part of the Tech Model Railroad Club, and Gordon Bell, who had designed the PDP-4 and would be the chief architect for many of the most important computers in history. He had also was at work for sort of what the next big step would be. The logic design was done by another figure we'll be hearing about more later, Edson de Castro. The PDP-5 was a huge success, and it proved to be the most important stepping stone towards mini-computers. The idea of a 12-bit machine was already out there, but the idea of a lower-cost, lower-powered, more user-focused 12-bit machine wasn't the norm. Link had proven that computers in wet labs and the like were a good idea, and the idea of a computer that could be in just about any scenario really untested. While the PDP-5 wasn't quite there, it was still refrigerator-sized. It was the bouncing point for the real leap, and it sold more than 1,000 units. Not a million units. I believe it was behind the IBM 1401 and probably the 1620 in unit sales at that point. In 1963, DEC decided to try to fight with the bunch. They produced a mainframe that was designed with real-time computing as a primary consideration. The PDP-6 was designed by Gordon Bell, and it had a larger system, and it used a 36-bit word. And the design used the same module as the other PDP machines, but it was harder to build and especially hard to install. Thus, they only sold about 23 units. But they might have been the right 23 units. Gordon Bell later noted, because the PDP-6 was the first computer to offer elegant, powerful capabilities at a lower price, a great many of the PDP-6s built found their way into university and scientific environments, giving DEC a strong foothold into the market, and providing both educated customer input for future models and a source for bright young future employees to assist in the hardware and software development of those future models. I'd like to apologize to any of Gordon's relatives for that imitation. I liked Gordon. The funny thing is that after that didn't take off, they said they weren't going to do any more big machines and leave the 36-bit market to IBM and the Seven Dwarves, but they reversed this and did an important machine later, the PDP-10, which I think is going to get its whole episode on that whole series. The PDP-6 was important in a lot of areas, and two I'll mention are artificial intelligence research and computer music. Many universities started early versions of AI labs built around the PDP-6. Now, the PDP-6 had time-sharing standard, which made it very useful in places like SAIL, the Stanford AI Lab. And there it was attached to a music coprocessor, the Samson box, and used to do many pieces of early computer music. I will point you to Engineers and Enthusiasts, where I did a whole episode about the Samson box. The PDP-7 was an interesting, though poorly timed machine. It was a follow-on to the 4, so they'd already left that line behind for the more or less. And it was the first to use the Digital Equipment Corporation flip chip, an advance which would give them a big leg up on future machines. It was the first wire-wrapped PDP also, which allowed for smaller machines. I find the PDP-6 to be one of the more interesting machines in this thing because of the association with Ken Thompson. Now, Thompson used the PDP-7 to write the first Unix system in 1969, and it was done in assembly language. And he wrote it as an operating system for a graphic game, Space Travel. If anyone has anything about this game, please let me know. Since I'm no longer at the museum, I haven't been able to get a hold of people like Ken. So, sadly, bummer. Mumps, which is an incredibly long-lived and important language in medicine, was developed on the PDP-7 at Mass General Hospital in Boston. It has a hierarchical database system at its very core, which is super rare and kind of cool. Digital grew a culture that both did and didn't resemble IBM with their 100% club and all that. It was centered in Massachusetts, but it was also far more centered on innovation than on sales. It was far more interested in the idea of usability and interactivity. The way they focused on smaller machines and concepts such as time-sharing made them seem at least somewhat friendlier than IBM. They also weren't competing for the supercomputer market, which probably helped. The culmination of the first act of Digital Equipment Corporation began in 1965 with the introduction of what would become the most important line of mini-computers and the best-selling computer of all time for a number of years. The PDP-8 will get its whole episode to itself, but I will say this now. Everyone saw the direction DEC was going by 1965, and it changed many areas of the computer industry. All right, that's the early history of DEC. I'm going to take a bit of a break, maybe, not fully sure, but the next episode will look at the rise of computer languages. I'm sorry, I know I've been meaning to do that. I will. I promise. Probably next. After that, we're going to either tackle one big or three smaller episodes called The Class of 1965. The IBM 360, the PDP-8, and the CDC 6600. Three of the most important computers, all of them defining a whole category of computing for the 1960s and 70s. After that, it's supercomputers in the 60s and 70s, and then it's mini-computers in the 60s and 70s. So I hope you all stay tuned. I'm Chris Garcia. Thanks for listening.